so I am going to start with a really warm welcome and welcome back to the show, Don.
Ooh, nice to be back.
And this time we're going to take a bit of a dive, or hopefully a deep dive, into the newly released Global Sentiment Survey, which is a survey that you take each year with thousands of L&D practitioners from around the world. So to kick things off then, I wondered if you could give just a super quick explanation of what the Sentiment Survey is and what it does and who with.
It's a very simple survey. The aim is to take the pulse of learning and development professionals worldwide. And we've done that every year for 13 years now. And the survey asks 5 questions. There are only 3 important questions in that. What do you think is hot? What challenges do you face in the year ahead? And new this year, what have you done that is new in the past 12 months? Apart from the one that's new this year, with the other one, we have longitudinal data where we can look at trends over time. And you do any survey as a snapshot, great. But once you've got 10 years of data, you can really start looking at how things have moved, and it starts to tell you something about how the profession is going. So there we are. It's a short-term pulse with a long-term, I hope, view.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And I love the new question that you've included too. I think that's going to be a great one to track. So we're going to dive into the detail in a little bit, but you have titled this year's report, Journey Without Maps. I wondered before we dive into looking at the data, if you could just give a bit of a heads up as to why you've named it that. What's calling out to you from this year's data?
Firstly, it's nothing to do with the Graham Greene book, Journey Without Maps, but the idea is the same, that we're entering into an area that is unknown. And having spent nearly 40 years in learning, development and technology, I firmly believe that things are going to change largely in the year ahead, but unlike a lot of commentators, I don't claim to know what's going to happen. So that's why I think we're definitely on a journey. I think it's definitely without maps. And very importantly, there is no choice about it. We are moving forward into a new world for learning and development where the past is no guide to the future. What we did successfully in the past won't help us very much in the future, which was the designing and distribution of content. That's still going to take place, but it's not going to be the core role of learning and development in the future. That's the without maps bit. We're going to journey into the future. What will our key role be? We can guess at it, but we don't know yet.
Yeah, interesting, yeah. And if we were to guide ourselves by the stars, then maybe we don't even know what the North Star is anymore at the moment. So, yeah.
Wow. Let's hope at least for clear skies so we can head in one direction.
Let's dive into a bit of the detail then from the report. So the survey asked 3 questions, as you said. What will be hot this year? What are your biggest L&D challenges? And then what have you been doing that's new in the last 12 months, your new question. So let's start with what's hot. What's coming out as what are the top headlines and what differs from previous years?
What doesn't differ is that artificial intelligence is number 1. I mean, it has been number 1 for for this year and the previous 2 years. The launch of ChatGPT led to artificial intelligence, which had been on the survey since 2017, accelerating up the table of 16 options that we give people. We let people choose any 1, 2 or 3 of those 16 options, but actually it's interesting that over 95% of people do choose to choose 3. Artificial intelligence is number 1, but the news is that the accelerating progress of artificial intelligence has stopped. It has topped out. In fact, the vote for it this year is very slightly less than it was last year. And I think we can say that the AI fever dream has finished, but that doesn't mean that AI is over. It simply means that our fascination, or more accurately, the fascination of the people answering the poll has peaked. Mm-hmm. Now, at some point, Kirsty, we need to explore something about this population that we're surveying, because there are 2 distinct groups in it, and I hope we'll get to that later on. They view artificial intelligence rather differently.
Okay, you're going to leave me hanging then now. So let's leave our listeners hanging and we'll come back to that then, I think.
That's one thing. That's one thing that's new. Other stuff that's new this year is that personalization continues to rise up the table, and so does showing value. And I think those things by themselves are very important. And if we combine that with the fact that learning analytics has dropped tremendously this year, I think that tells us a story about learning and development. The personalization and showing value go up and learning analytics come down. Why? There's a story behind that for sure.
Yeah, and those three, to me, there should be a neat Venn diagram between all three of those. So I'm kind of intrigued as to why we're seeing data analytics drop off when value's going up. And also you need data to be able to personalize and be adaptive. So yeah, very intrigued about that. And maybe it's becoming a given. I'm not sure it is, but yeah, let's dive in a moment.
Okay.
Are there any other items that were kind of previously hot or hottish, warm, that have taken a bit of a dive this year?
On the challenges question, it was very interesting that in the first 2 years of doing it, which I think is 22 and 23, 40% of people answered the question. And then in 2024, over 90% of people answered it. And by far and away, the biggest challenge people thought they had was AI. Well, I won't say it's necessarily the biggest challenge, but technology as a whole became the biggest challenge. And it's a free text answer. What's your biggest challenge? 60 people just wrote AI. They could write as much as they wanted to. They just wrote AI and that was it. Then last year in 2025, only 3 people responded AI, and technology was no longer the biggest set of challenges that people had. And I thought, well, that's great. We've gone past the idea of AI as a monster. Now we're getting acclimatized to it. This year, it's different. While the interest in AI has peaked and it's flattened off that curve of interest, the people saying that AI is a problem for them, is a challenge, has absolutely rocketed back up again. Technology's gone back to being the leading issue for us. And 45 people have responded that AI is their biggest problem. That's all they wrote in the box. And I think that's a fascinating swing. It's almost like we had a breather, we thought it was okay, and now coming back for the second round, or the third year of really being involved with AI in the guise of generative AI, in this third year, we've realized that actually it's much bigger than we thought it was. And honestly, I think people are scared. So I think that's a really big swing that's worth thinking about.
So reading between the lines and the fascination, for example, with AI, the novelty perhaps is not quite wearing off, but less fascination into it is a kind of concept or something new. But how to use it, how to integrate it, how to apply it well, there's still a lot of challenges around that.
That's very well expressed. And in conjunction with that, a growing sense, I think now, which we didn't have 3 years ago, of foreboding about implications for jobs. I think there's absolutely a real sense that my job is at risk here. And I think people are right to be worried about that.
Yeah, well, we're seeing lots of changes. We're also seeing new roles pop up, which are, is not a bad thing, but they might be quite different to what people are used to.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit more about the challenges then, since we've gone into that zone. You mentioned tech as kind of the number one that's peaked its head. I think in second place we've got strategy, skills, and talent. Is that right?
Yeah, and what I do is I check a group of words, or actually word stems. So I look at the word stem skill, and that includes upskilling, reskilling, and so on. And I measure how many comments do these words appear in, and from that I try to take a quantitative approach to the data of the words people use, as well as a qualitative approach, which I also take by reading everything and saying what I think people are thinking. And by the way, when we're talking about reading people's responses to this, it's worth pointing out that there were, I think, something like 40,000 words that people came up with this year in terms of their responses, which is a substantial novella, right? That's longer than The Old Man and the Sea by a long chalk. So there's a lot of stuff going on there, which I have to read. So I do the reading, but I also, because I want to counter my natural biases of finding patterns, I look at the words and just count the words.
Yeah.
And when you count the words, technology is way out in front now. Having been number 2 last year, it's now number 1 in the group of concerns. Interestingly, it talked about the difference between qualitative and quantitative. If I look at the words, what jumps out is that people are concerned about budgets.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that might be my bias, because when I count the word budget and funding and associated words, the category of resources, which has been a challenge for the last 3 years, has actually fallen away this year.
Right.
So it's less of a problem this year. I think it's interesting. There seems to be always a trade-off in people's minds that if I'm concerned about technology, I'm not concerned about something else. in the past, people have always been concerned at an increasing level about resources, not so much this year, which I'm finding difficult to understand.
Yeah, and I guess looking at that combination, if you've got talent up front and then strategy, skills, reskilling, upskilling, all the skill words and talent, then I mean, my take would be that of course you probably don't know what you're doing with your technology and where to invest if it is a money thing as well. If that's come out, in the statements, if you've not got your strategy in place, and who has right now, the 5-year plan doesn't really exist anymore. A 1-year plan is hard enough, right? For given the amount of change that's happening. So I'm not surprised to see those together because ideally you wouldn't be looking at your tech stack and working out what your ecosystem should be. And we know it needs to change. You can't continue doing the same stuff you've done before, but you can't just plug things in without knowing what your strategy is, right?
Yeah, I think the strategy piece is people are having difficulty with it. So yeah, I think you're right that if strategy is something people are spending less time on, then there's going to be a problem with technology. You need to get the technology sorted out before you can understand your strategy. At the same time, of course, how do you sort out your technology? Well, you've got to understand your strategy. So the two are intimately intertwined. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I having a kind of sneak preview at some of the data that's in there, then I noticed that also data analysis and impact is listed as one of the top challenges this year, which is interesting when it's not necessarily hot, so it might not be a focus, but yet it's still seen as a challenge. So that stood out to me.
That's really interesting always, is looking at the balance. Yeah. Looking at the balance between what's hot and the challenges is, I don't know what happened. It's always interesting looking at the balance between what's hot and the challenges, for sure, because people won't mention something in the hot, what they think is hot, but then it rears its head in the challenges. It's also the case that in the challenges we see differences or not between different populations. So I won't go into the details now because I'm still doing the research, but it is quite clear that certain geographies see challenges in different ways. It's also true that different groups of people see challenges in different ways, which is fascinating in itself. And that's going to be explored quite a bit in the report in a way that I haven't done in the past.
Okay, that's exciting. And I know the report looks at in-house L&D practitioners versus, for example, freelancers and consultants. So
yes,
I imagine there's some differences there. But yeah, really interested to look at geographies.
Yeah. And I want to come back to this mention of the two groups that I mentioned earlier, that we have two very clear clusters of people in answering the survey. And it's something I noticed back in 2018 that there were two groups that were voting in different ways. And it was quite clear that the first group responded very quickly to the survey and they were largely accessed through social media. And then the second group responded later and they were accessed typically through email. And I thought at the time, well, okay, so let's call them Group A and Group B. Group A, who respond sooner via social media, are people who are possibly early adopters. They are more attuned to what's going on. But I didn't have any evidence for that, so I didn't make a big thing about it. Well, what has happened since is that last year, for the first time, I asked people to provide their emails if they wanted to get a copy of the report, and over 90% of people do. And then this year I asked the same thing, which meant I was able to see, well, who voted last year, who's also voted this year. The people who voted last year and who've come back to vote again this year vote in the way that Group A was acting in 2018 and has presumably since. They are the people who are most engaged in online conversation and who are keenest to share their thoughts about what's happening with learning and development. And what really struck me about this is that this group, which I call the returners, and the newbies, I call the newbies. So most people voting on the survey, by far the majority, 85%-ish, are new people. If they're coming to the survey for the first time, and these are the people who are excited by technology and things that have been on the learning plate, if you like, for a long time. Micro-learning, learning experience platforms, or methodologies like collaborative and social learning. So that's something these people prefer. The returning voters are more concerned about methodologies and things which are talked about a great deal online, in particular showing value and reskilling and upskilling. So these things are, if you like, the hot topics of conversation in the, I don't know, the online salon, if you like, of the L&D world. What I found very interesting was that there is the biggest difference between the two groups is in artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And strangely, the returning voters, the people who've been voting previously and who are attuned to what's going on and a part of those conversations, are the most enthusiastic about AI, voting it about 4% higher than the people who've come into the survey for the first time. That's the opposite of what I expected. I thought, well, the people who've been online a lot will be rather cynical about AI, and the other people will be subjected to it via what we hear through our daily lives. But it's not that way round. Now, what I noticed in the past was that the people who are attuned to what's happening, what the discourse is around L&D, those people tend to move on to new topics, and then Group B, the people who are returners, or people who are new to the survey but who spend less time online, those people sort of pick up where Group A left off. So they'll become enthusiastic about stuff after Group A has possibly become enthusiastic and then abandoned it. Well, that seems to be happening when I look at the data this year for newbies and returners. Because if I look at how the returners were voting last year, they were voting very much for the stuff that the newbies are voting for this year. It's almost like there's a 12-month lag. It's extraordinary. Mm. And so I'm asking myself, what happens to AI? Do we have AI as being an online subject of fascination and it's going to percolate through to the rest of the L&D world next year? There's a distinct possibility. I don't know. I as always, well, I was going to say I can't wait to see, but actually, Kirsty, I'm going to take AI off the list of options to choose from next year. Lots of reasons for that, but I think mostly it doesn't make sense. It is what's called a general purpose technology, of which there have been 24.
Like the internet, right?
Like the internet, like writing, like language, like fire, the wheel. It's a general purpose technology, and asking people to choose between asking people to choose between AI and a learning experience platform is like saying what's more important, your microwave or your dishwasher or electricity. Doesn't make sense as a choice. So it's coming off the list next year. I'm going to have to find a way to play with the data in the background to make sense of my historical data. I'm happy to do that. I think it's time to move on.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting one with the newbies / returners breakdown. I guess when you were talking, I was thinking, is it representative of a maturity curve in terms of what people are doing? Or is there also a possibility that the returners are, I think you call it the online salon, or within a bubble, where there's a chance they're paying lip service to things that they know they ought to say. Yep. You know what I mean? So where does realism lie? Probably in between the two, yeah. So I would imagine.
Yeah, I was trying to avoid the word bubble. That's why I chose the word salon.
Which I like. I like the way you maybe get your hair done whilst chatting to someone online.
People having a nice conversation together while they're doing their work. I'd like to think that's what's happening. Mm-hmm. There is no doubt that, of course, there is an amplifying effect of being online. So, and I think it's very interesting to watch this balance of the two groups, and we shall definitely be tracking that going forward and seeing how the voting changes.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Just circling back to the challenges which we were touching on a minute ago that came out, and you mentioned that you were reading all of the comments, which means there's probably more feeling or more sentiment that you've picked up on that there might be presented in the kind of top level data, which is looking at the words people use. Yeah. Is there anything else that you think is worthy of passing on? Like, what did you feel is going on in terms of the major challenges for L&D at the moment?
That is a great question. If I can be vague, that obviously the survey revolves a lot around numbers, but I can be vague and respond with a sort of emotional, visceral response. I'd say there's a sense of not what we had 3 years ago, which was overwhelm, the sense that people didn't know what was going on and that AI was changing everything. There is some of that. But more disturbingly and deeper, I think, there's a sense of dread, of fear, of existential crisis. I don't want to overdo it, but I do get a sense, looking at the answers, that people are really worried about a whole bunch of things, particularly about their jobs, but also about the quality of learning and about the state of the planet, all of which again comes back to AI. So there's a lot going on there. But if you want me to sum it up in one word, and it's a negative word, I'm afraid, it is dread, fear for what's happening right now. And I think that's not uncommon when you're going through a period of huge disruptive change, which I don't believe is going to stop anytime soon, by the way.
I think, and really what you reflected on there is it's not just an L&D problem. If that would be way too simplistic, right? It's systematic, it's across the board, but also beyond work, right? It's the whole world and the future. And I think we're seeing in things like employee engagement surveys and different reports from people like Gallup that there's a fatigue out there. And so I've talked about that from an L&D point of view, is how can you can't just throw out learning and expect employees right now to pick it up and crack on with the changes. Everybody's kind of collectively exhausted, maybe fearful, might have dread like you talk about. And so actually that's within L&D as well as beyond it. And so that does actually affect how you play your learning culture, where you go next as well.
I think it really does. I mean, there are limits to how much influence L&D can have over what's going on in the world. But there's that quote from Arthur Ashe, which I won't get right, but I'll try to do justice to it. Start where you are, do what you can with what you have. It's something like that. And I think we can't do everything, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do something. Mm-hmm. So let's try to make our corner of the world as good as it can be in a time when change looks frightening.
Yeah. Okay, well, that leads us in nicely then to what have people been doing, L&D people been doing in the last 12 months that's new, and perhaps we can get a bit of hope from that.
Well, because this is a new question, and up till this point, running the survey, I've focused on sentiment, what people feel about things, whether it's a challenge or a list, because that's indisputable. If you feel that something is hot, great, that's your feeling, or a challenge. Okay, I get it. And the reason I started doing that was because I had tried doing surveys with people saying, what are you going to do in the year ahead? And you'd get a list of, as long as your arm, of things that were aspirations rather than plans. And at the end of the year, if you asked people what they'd actually done, there was very little correlation. So I thought, well, I'm not going to ask people what they plan to do, but I will ask people what they've done. Mm-hmm. We still suffer from the issue of this being self-reporting. Now, if I look back to the AI in L&D report last September with Eglevin Alskaita, and there we look at some of the stuff that people are doing around AI in L&D. It's good and it's challenging. It doesn't correspond a great deal with what people say they're doing in this report. Furthermore, the things that people say they're doing also seem strangely to be the challenges that people have. Now, I have to get my head around this, but it's almost like people are aware, some people are aware there's a problem, they say it in the challenges section, other people have been tackling the problem. I haven't come across any instances of people who've simultaneously said something is a challenge and that they've tackled it. But it seems that there's a strong correlation between those two. But anyway, let's talk about what people are doing. Firstly, this absolutely matches the AI in L&D survey of September last year, 2025. AI has gone through the inflection point, and we knew this from that report, which is that over half the surveyed population was using AI. Now we know that, practically speaking, people are actually using AI in their everyday work. And they're using it for content creation, naturally. We know that's one of the biggest bits. But there are also other things coming along which are quite interesting. Things like personalization, certainly, coaching, simulations. And I think coaching and simulations are two areas which I've been sort of banging a drum about for a number of years, since about 2018. I really think the time has come for those to be a tool that is within affordability for most L&D departments. So that's one exciting thing. People are now shifting away, people report that they're shifting away from courses and designing big chunks of content through to much smaller elements. Now, whether this is well designed, I'm not going to comment on, but they are producing stuff that is around micro-learning, journeys, And there is also an area of performance support that's been focused on. Call that learning in the flow of work, if you will. I'm not sure that it genuinely is learning, but it's helping people do their jobs better. People claim they're using data and analytics to guide their decisions. And we do know from September's report that qualitative data analysis, so looking particularly at words rather than quantitative, looking at numbers, qualitative data analysis has definitely gone up in terms of the amount that people say they're doing. So that matches.
Yeah.
And again, we don't know how mature this use of data is. We don't know how well people are doing it, but people are talking about it. And I'll be very interested next year to see whether that incidence increases or not. Now, the final thing, this is where the self-reporting bit I'm always a bit dubious about. I have to honour the fact that people have honestly said that this is what they're doing, but I'm always questioning how much impact we actually are having in L&D. So when people say that they're now more involved with culture, they're more involved with well-being and so on, I don't have enough detail to say what exactly that means. I think it's very interesting that people are seeing L&D expanding its role, because I think it probably needs to. There is always a risk with that, and I'm not saying that's true for the people who've done the survey, but there's always a risk that if L&D is doing a number of things rather than a handful of things, that it's seen as being a jack of all trades and a master of none. So it's a double-edged sword that way, but certainly L&D's role seems to be expanding, and that goes with against the challenge of people finding that their role seems to be at risk. And I think what's perhaps happening is that generally people perceive there's a challenge there, and some people attacking it by spreading the responsibility, which makes sense. If you're responsible, you've got your finger in more pies, there's less risk that you're going to have your job disappear.
Yeah. And I think, I think we've talked about it before, that there's no singular way for L&D to move forward, and it's going to be different in every context. But for me, it's like the great breakdown. It's no longer, it shouldn't be, or it shouldn't have been for a long time, that we are the people that make courses and we are the people that make content. We're the people that do what you ask. That shouldn't have been the case anyway, but we know it was for a lot of L&D teams. So if you've got the great breakdown, it's like where to go. And for some, that might be focusing on skills, and for others, that might be coaching with AI or without. For others, they're really embedding themselves into, as you say, like well-being, mental health, the kind of culture of learning. I guess some people are experimenting of which way to go, but they're just trying to break away from what they were, which I think, for all those things you've just mentioned, even though we're not looking at the quality or the impact measures of those, like hooray for all of that, because I think that's, when you weigh that up against maybe the fear that you talked about that people have, or the sense of dread, then at least some people are taking some steps forward into not what they've done before, which is as much as we can probably ask, right?
I think it's a really good point. On these books behind me, I've got a book by George Land, Grow or Die, when he talks about the patterns which get reproduced in a wide range of systems, organic systems, financial systems, social systems, where there's a period of chaos out of which comes order and systems which are capable of dealing with things and which grow. But as they grow and become more efficient, they also ossify. They become more and more, if you like, hidebound, until eventually they slow down. We enter a new period of chaos, and then from that emerges a new way of doing things. I don't think we are even in that period of chaos yet. I think we're entering into it. And I think what you're suggesting there is absolutely right. Look, if things need to change, let's try a bunch of things and see what works. Let's let 1,000 flowers bloom, as they said. And from those, one or two great ideas will come out. I think the key thing, this is where the Journey Without Maps story comes back. The key thing is that we are not looking backwards, because there is no hinterland. We have to go forward, because the old hinterland that we are about creating, distributing content is gone, because that can now be done at hundredths or thousandths of the cost of doing it in the past, thanks to generative AI. Now, not all content can be done as well, and there is some content that we should be focusing on for sure. But if we align ourselves purely with content, we are going to get lost, no question. We have to keep moving forward, even if we don't have a map.
Especially if people are saying what's hot is providing value, right? If you're committed to that, then you need to break away from that model.
Yeah, we do.
So yeah, I was about to ask that, if we circle back to the title of Journey Without Maps, then, let's talk a little bit more about that. But I was going to ask, is everyone on the same journey, do we think? And I think we've just answered that one.
Well, let me come back to the challenges on that one, because it is possible, as I say, geographically to split how people are seeing the world. And if you look at, we had over 500 respondents from both the UK and the US, which I'm delighted by, because in the past, the UK has always dominated the survey. Now, I think it's about 15% of respondents, which is great. And to have roughly the same number, I mean, it's within a few respondents between the UK and the US, means we've got two big populations we can compare with each other, more than 500 each. And they are not quite, if we look at the challenges, feeling themselves to be on the same journey exactly. So the UK respondents really are looking at survival and trying to be people who are strategically influencing. And I think that's part of the economic situation in the UK. So we often look at it through austerity, organisational neglect. Those are the challenges that come through. People are feeling they've got to tactically shift things in order to survive. Whereas in the US, there's much more focus on scale, on systems, on big enterprises, and they're also feeling, of course, commercial pressure, but it's not the same as the economic pressure being felt in the UK. And so, no, people are not on the same journey, and context, that word you raised right at the beginning, is crucial. We absolutely come back to that sense that everyone's on their own journey. And I think it's very important, if you're in that online space, to remember that what you hear from somebody in California may not be particularly relevant to you in Cleethorpes, or it might be, but work out what your particular focus is and what your context is, and start from there. Don't start trying to make somebody else's answer fit your context.
And if many in L&D were having an identity crisis or an existential crisis, then how can somebody move forward, do you think? Like, what kind of mindset shifts, perhaps, do you think that they should be making?
I very often talk about a book from 1964 by Duncan Bithell called The Hand Loom Weavers, and its subtitle is A Study in the English Cotton Industry During the Industrial Revolution. The headline for this is that in about 1780, there were 430,000 people operating hand looms. 100 years later, there were 10,000. A hand loom is a machine that you use to make cloth, and you typically use it in a cottage. You make beautiful cloth according to a design, and that gets collected and used by people who go from cottage to cottage. So the parallel with learning and development is pretty clear. If you're sitting in your studio creating lovely e-learning, and you distribute it onto your network, you've had a fairly clear, predictable career up till now, and then suddenly technology and economic circumstance pulls the rug, sorry to use the textile pun, but you get the rug pulled out from underneath you. And what happened to all these people who were hand loom weavers, who were skilled people who didn't have a job anymore? Well, they all went to different places. They didn't disappear. And I think what will happen is some people in L&D will stay at their loom, will stay doing the same job, because of course there are ups and downs. There will be periods when you will be needed to do that job that you've always done. Some hand loom weavers went to work in the specialist silk industry, which was different and didn't get mechanized until much later. And there will be equivalents. So there'll be some areas where, if you're an instructional designer with a particular focus, there'll be a niche you can exploit which will not be subject to the vicissitudes of technology. And there'll be other people who say, look, this isn't for me. I can't make a living at this anymore. And I think we have to be honest about that. If you think about supply and demand, if the supply of people able to do a job goes up, then the price that each of them can command for it is likely to be driven down by competing buyers. Now, how big is that effect? Looking at the marketplace in L&D, I don't think that you need very many people to be out of work who are doing instructional design for competitive pricing to come in and people to start undercutting each other. And I think very soon, perhaps you have a 10% drop in the number of people who are employed in the field. Suddenly those 10% people unemployed, pretty much having to price themselves back into work, which means cutting their prices, which means that there is less money to go round. And unfortunately, this means that there will be price competition, and some people simply won't find it worthwhile to keep doing what they've always done, whether it's instructional design or anything else. So what I'm saying brutally, in answer to your question, Kirsty, is that for some people, it's simply not going to be worthwhile still being in L&D. I think we're going to be entering a period where there'll be a really brutal period of years, let's say 2 years, 3 years, during which there'll be a lot of unemployment and a lot of people moving on to other things. And I know people are doing this and they're doing other things and very happy with it. And they won't want to come back to learning and development. But if the market picks up in 3 years' time, what will it look like? I don't think it will look like what it is now. And I think there'll be different jobs demanding different skills. And it may be that the skill set you had in 2026 doesn't get you a job in 2029. So I would say, sorry, it sounds very negative, but I'd say the thing to do right now is to consider your context for your job, for yourself, and your skill set.
And I think the challenges that you called out earlier that have come out in this year's report, they give some hints, and obviously, again, it's context specific. You've got to find out what your business needs and what your stakeholders need. But they give hints as to where you might invest yourself or you'll get your team, if you're an L&D leader, to do some upskilling. So tech is there, but is that, looking at the ecosystem, understanding how a system works to support learning as an environment, as something that's always on, always available, for example. It's quite different to what we've meant by tech for learning in the past, because it wasn't integratable in the way it is now. Strategy, skills, talent, like, are you a skills-based organisation? Are there teams that are moving towards that? What are the skills gaps? If they're still called competency, then what are the competency gaps, and really drill into those. And I think people might align themselves with, in a decentralised way, with pockets of skills, and you can become a real specialist. And then you've got data on there, right? So that is listed as kind of one of the number one areas that people feel they need to be skilled up on, data literacy. It's not new. I think that's come up a lot, but actually it's now really needed. For some, it won't be everybody's bag. I know I love qualitative data. I'm less good with quantitative data, but of course I could decide to upskill myself in that if I felt I needed to. But I think it's kind of placing a bet, picking a pathway, but doing it based on not guessing, but going to speak to people in your organisation, asking leaders, and getting out there a bit more, right?
I think there's also, whether it's at an individual or an organisational level, a certain amount of experimentation is valuable. But if you're experimenting with something, let's say I decide, well, I'm going to try to develop my data skills and use that in my job. It's always vital to know that you can and should stop the experiment if it's not working.
Yeah.
So let's say you develop some data skills, but you find that actually that's not what your organisation wants. It might be useful elsewhere, but they're not useful where you are. Then stop and turn your attentions to something else. And the one thing I would always say is worth doing is nothing to do with technology. It's to do with networking. You're only going to know what's happening in your organisation, and you're going to give yourself the greatest protection against job losses by having a good, strong network internally. And I find it really interesting. When I was doing my book, Learning Technologies in the Workplace, the people who'd done the most effective learning technologies implementations, and it was a factor I hadn't thought about at all, were those who'd either been in job a long time, so they knew the organisation really well and they had a good network, or they'd come in and they had deliberately built out their network very quickly within joining the company. And so the network proved to be, surprisingly to me, a factor that directly correlated with how successful a learning technologies implementation was. So I build your network because that way you protect yourself and you learn what's necessary.
Yeah, I actually interviewed somebody yesterday, and there'll be a video out soon about with that person in it. But they're actually increasing the size of their L&D team in their corporation. It's growing, and the reason it's growing is because they networked out to understand what individual teams or departments needed. And now they're actually recruiting people from those skill areas, if you like, back into the L&D team as a kind of hybrid role, so they can specialise in developing the skills for those regions. So that was a brilliant story to hear. It was going up, not down. So that was a great thing to hear through the power of networking. So there you go.
There you go.
So what final tip do you think you could give, Don, to L&D leaders out there who might be feeling overwhelmed, maybe even the dread that you've mentioned the dreaded dread? Any kind of final tips or words of wisdom from you?
It's a trite thing for somebody to say, sitting at his desk, who's not facing those challenges. And I absolutely know people are working flat out. But I would say, make time. It sounds a bit strange and a bit abstract. The issue is that people are feeling overwhelmed because there is so much going on and they are fighting fires and trying to take care of things all the time. And I think that's impossible if you are in the process of fighting fires all the time. In order to get a strategic view of what's important and to prioritize all those things coming to your desk, you need a bit of time to breathe. And I would say the best thing you can do right now is to stop doing stuff that you don't think is helping your organization or yourself. It may be you have to do stuff which you don't like and it's time intensive, but the organization demands it. Fair enough. But how important is it really? I think prioritization, and then make yourself time to think and to network and to understand from other people in the organization what's important. That is the most important thing. And also, don't build your network just inside the organization, but outside it as well, because outside the organization, you're going to get inputs on what they're doing. And also, that's where your next job is coming from. So be aware that there are people out there you can be talking to who might want you to work with them in the future.
Brilliant. So we need to go from being humans and sort of like octopi, extend our tentacles out there a bit broader than we have been. Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much for joining me today to talk through the survey. Of course, there's a lot more in the data, in the report. And so a huge recommendation for people to go away and go and dive into it and extract what they think it's showing them as well and share that back.
The other thing, Kirsty, of course, is that we now have questions on a lot of pages in the survey where we prompt people to think about, well, all right, that's what 3,500 people say, but your context is crucial. Mm-hmm. What do you think? So look, a lot of people tell me it's valuable as a way of generating discussion in their teams. I'd love it if you could pick it up and generate a discussion in your team using it.
Brilliant. Thank you. Excellent. Thanks then, Don. And I'll speak to you soon.
Absolutely.